Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Tech Forum this Sunday. My name is John Humphrey. I'm a member of the Sunday Forum Committee. Sunday Forums are our opportunity to have conversations about faith and life. We seek to provide a thoughtful and welcoming learning environment for members and friends of Plymouth. The Sunday Forum Committee schedules weekly presentations during the year and then monthly presentations over the summer. There are hearing devices. I don't think you'll need one, but if you need a hearing device, there are hearing devices right at the door. Feel free to make use of them. Let's see. Thank you to Cody for providing our audiovisual assistance this morning. And our guest this morning is Kyle, sorry. He'll be talking to us about Christian nationalism. Kyle is from UTS. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Kyle, and we'll begin our presentation.
Thank you for inviting me, John, and introducing me. Thank you all for coming to this discussion. And I hope it will be that, a discussion. I'm grateful to be here. United Seminary, we're located just off of 94 in St. Paul, Midway area, quite close. And we have a close relationship with Plymouth Congregational. We have our, if you don't know, we have our commencement service here every year. And we so appreciate you offering up and opening up your church building for that purpose. Our students have a deep affinity with this place, actually, when they graduate and move on. So great to be with you. This is, I was remarking earlier that it's too bad we don't have a more relevant topic to talk about today. But we'll try to make some connections as we go. But I do also want to acknowledge that it might be a difficult topic to broach and to discuss at this moment in our history with an election just a few days ahead. For those who have not already cast your votes. So that is something I just want to acknowledge, that there may be some anxiety in the room because of that, and we're talking about this topic, which is so important to understand and to unpack and uncover some of the deeper dimensions of it. And so that's what I'll try to do this morning. And I do invite you to raise your hand if you have a question. We have a mic up here that you can come up to speak into. We can either save those questions till after the presentation, or if you have questions or need clarification at any point along the way, feel free to come up and ask them, or to raise your hand, and we can acknowledge that. So let me just, brief story. I'm from Kansas, Wichita area, actually. We went back to visit, my wife and I and our little two kids at the time, about 10 years ago, to visit my grandmother in Derby, Kansas. We went to church, and it was July 4th weekend. I kind of knew what to expect, but not really. As we entered the church building, we were all handed little flags to take with us to our seats. This isn't an actual picture of the service, but you kind of get the idea. So everybody's got flags, and there was this presentation, recorded kind of presentation that they were using in the church service, and it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, and nothing I'll ever experience again. I hope, but that was in fact my, I won't say introduction to Christian nationalism, but certainly an introduction to a really egregious, explicit Christian nationalism that was taking place within the construct of an actual church building. And so that moment, kind of, when I think of Christian nationalism, I think of that moment, and I think of the influence that experience would have on the folks participating and contributing to that. So what is nationalism? And I'm going to have to kind of lean over so I can see my notes here. This is a definition from Stephen Backhouse, a scholar of Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher, and I am too, so I know Stephen and his work. And this is also, for me, my kind of way into understanding Christian nationalism is actually through a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian. But in his book, Backhouse defines nationalism. Well, he mentions that nationalism is notoriously difficult to define. It's a powerful ideology which harnesses ideals of personal identity, history, race, and language, often in order to promote good citizenship or human flourishing, whose values are attributed to the privileging of a particular cultural, ethnic identity. Kind of an academic definition, and we've got a few of these coming, and I apologize for that, but we'll break apart some of this and have some conversation about it. Paul Miller, in an article on Christianity Today, actually, says that most scholars agree that nationalism starts with the belief that humanity is divisible into mutually distinct, internally coherent cultural groups defined by shared traits like language, religion, ethnicity, or culture. From there, scholars say, nationalists believe that these groups should each have their own governments, that government should promote and protect a nation's cultural identity, and that sovereign national groups provide meaning and purpose for human beings. Again, a fairly academic, intellectual definition of nationalism. Now, nationalism, like any other ism or ideology, exists on a spectrum, right? There's a wide range of expressions, what counts or what might qualify as nationalism. So on one extreme, you might say on one end, you might say there's extreme nationalism or explicit nationalism. The nationalism or the Christian nationalism, that when you go into a church, they hand you a flag and expect you to wave it. On the other end, and it gets more extreme than that, right, by the way. On the other end is what's sometimes called banal nationalism, kind of implicit, seemingly, perhaps on the surface, harmless nationalism, patriotism, right? Kind of appreciation for one's cultural identity, national association, the collective unit of which one is a part, Pledge of Allegiance. At every public sporting event, what do? We sing the Star-Spangled Banner. So there's that kind of nationalism that is sort of embedded, imbued in the fabric of a society's culture. And that has sometimes been called a kind of banal nationalism. But that's not necessarily benign nationalism. There's such thing as banal evil, right, that articulated by Hannah Arendt. But is any nationalism truly benign? And I think that's an important question for us as Christians, perhaps in particular, in this moment to consider. Backhouse, again, says that nationalism encompasses that which establishes a sense of the common in a society, including religious and generational wisdom that is privileged for racial and ethnic reasons. Nationalism contributes to many of the narratives by which people live their lives and base their prejudices. It's part of the socialization, that fabric. It's part of the cultural memory and mythologies and language and ideas and ideals, values that just permeates the system of a society and our institutions. So, but I think the point of that is to say, is even banal nationalism always or necessarily benign nationalism? Or ought we always to be thinking, at least somewhat critically, about even those seemingly harmless forms of nationalism? I think it's important to know, in this moment in particular, in our history, in our culture, in our society, that nationalism is not new. Certainly not brand new, not 10 years old, not 6 years old or whatever. Many scholars trace the emergence of nationalism as a collective social consciousness to the late 1700s. And then the 19th century, the 1800s, sees this flourishing of nationalism across Europe, Eurasia, and, of course, America, the United States in particular. I'm learning a lot about history these days because my 9th grade daughter is taking AP history. So I'm kind of reading along with her world history, and there was a chunk of weeks there where she was being taught, and the book was talking about nationalism, about this flourishing of a kind of collective social identity that was spreading across these parts of the world, in which collectives of people organized through borders, boundaries, and governments began to kind of assert this sense of an individual, sovereign, distinctive cultural and collective and national identity. That is relatively new, right? And again, not 10 years old, but several hundreds of years old. And then there are scholarly arguments about, well, we've always had nations, right? As long as there have been people living in certain parts of the world that I have this kind of collective sense of identity and borderedness, and then you get into these academic debates. But here's this kind of three of the big moments of the emergence of nationalism in the 18th century. The first partition of Poland, the first partition of Poland in 1775, the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then the French Revolution unfolding in beginning in 1789. So that's nationalism, and it's important to understand that background, that underlying historical context for the Christian nationalism that we see expressed, manifested today. So then what is Christian nationalism in particular? Not just nationalism, but Christian nationalism. Jerry Gale, you may be familiar with Jerry, local person, United Methodist, who participates in the group Christians Against Christian Nationalism Minnesota. Jerry spoke at United, actually, a number of weeks ago. And he offers this definition of Christian nationalism, which I thought is helpful. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. It suggests that real Americans, quote unquote, are Christians, and true Christians, quote unquote, hold a particular set of beliefs. Paul Miller, again, referring to him, his work in Christianity Today, an evangelical publication, by the way, if you don't know. Miller says that Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Popularly, Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation, not merely as an observation about American history, but as a prescriptive program for what America must continue to be in the future. That's important, right? Not just a casual observation about historical origins and sort of the arguments that one could have about how Christian America was in its beginnings. But rather, Christian nationalism asserts that there is an ideal toward which true Americans and true Christians should continually aspire, and that is to maintain this cultural and religious identity, and those are merged as one thing. So what does Christian nationalism want? Or what is Christian nationalism? Continued, I'm just going to skip this because it's basically saying the same thing, but it has to do with exceptionalism, right? U.S. exceptionalism and Christian supremacy and how those are combined and merged into a single kind of objective or ideal. What do Christian nationalists want? Well, Christian nationalists seek to advance an agenda promoting a culturally and religious homogeneous identity, values, and practices so that they become and remain dominant. In short, they desire cultural power and social influence and work to retain that cultural power and social influence within and even beyond a nation. So it's not just about the nation itself and controlling the ideals and values and aspirations within the nation, but it's also a kind of assertion of supremacy over and against other national identities and nations and religious identities. And when, of course, people who don't share those values or are perceived not to share those values, identities, practices, religions, and so forth, come into the country that is supposedly the Christian nation, then you have problems. Then you have conflicts, and then you have a desire to purge the outsider and to marginalize the outsider from within. Well, I mentioned my work in Kierkegaard. This is Nikolai Grundtvig. Anybody ever heard of Grundtvig? All right, no Danes in here. Grundtvig's a really important figure in Denmark, historical figure. And was a cultural thinker, philosopher, religious poet, a hymn writer, he was sort of like the Wesleys of America in Denmark in terms of the influence of religious poem and poetry and hymn writing in Denmark. But also a politician. He established the folk school in Denmark, which is a public kind of continuing education program for adults that still exists today. He was very influential in Danish history and culture, as it says here. And his influence prompted an energetic nationalism and contributed to the sort of rise of nationalism in Denmark in the 19th century. He had all these kind of interesting theological views, too. He didn't really believe that the written Bible was very important. In fact, that the living word transcends and is sort of supersedes the written text of the Bible, which is controversial in Orthodox circles in those days. Had a very distinctive view of the Apostles' Creed as originating originally from Jesus to the disciples and continuing on through language. He thought, all this worry about reading the Bible in the original languages, Hebrew and Danish. You can see how much of a Kierkegaard scholar I am. What was it? Hebrew and Greek, right? Hebrew and Old Testament, New Testament. He's like, we don't need to read the Bible in its original languages. We need to use our own language. Our mother tongue, that's how God speaks through history, is through our national cultural language. That's where revelation happens. That's where God's living word takes root and takes place. And so the supremacy and the importance of a people for their language was a part of this kind of national identity, this movement toward a collective national cultural consciousness. And language is one of those then boundaries, right? This is what matters. Our language, our speech, our ways of understanding and interpreting the world. Well, there were other influences on nationalism in Denmark, which had a state church at the time, and actually Grundtvig was responsible for kind of dismantling some of the ways that the state church operated and functioned, and allowing for some free church elements to be included within the national church structure. But Kierkegaard comes along and has some pretty incisive critiques of Grundtvig and of other nationalist figures who are more politically oriented. And I won't go into my whole Kierkegaard spiel. Bring me back, John, for another time if anyone's interested. But Backhouse does this nice little summary here. He says that for Kierkegaard to speak positively of a national religion was to misunderstand the nature both of nations and of religion. Christianity is related to the individual. This is very much a Kierkegaard theme. As an existentialist, you sometimes hear of him as the father of existentialism. He wrote in 1853, but Christendom is related to lower notions of religion, specifically to national religion and national God, he wrote in his journals. In 1854, he fumed, state churches and people's churches and Christian countries are nonsense. We could use a little Kierkegaard today. So what's dangerous about nationalism? Nothing. Let's just go home. No, it does not recognize and honor the true diversity and fluidity of cultures, and it imposes collective identity through borders and lines. You belong if you're this. You belong if you speak this language, if you have this accent, if you share these cultural values. If you don't belong, right? That's dangerous. It leads to both subtle or banal and extreme forms and everything in between, forms of racism, xenophobia, and ethnocentrism, including, of course, white supremacy and all the evils that entail and follow from that. It creates justifications for unjust national actions, policies, and behaviors. For example, unjust wars, violence against religious and ethnic minorities, and so on. It instills a purity culture that can be violent, exclusionary, and demeaning. Anybody ever heard of Project 2025? All right, here's what we want. Here's the ideal. And this is what we're going to work to maintain. It's a purity culture mindset that's exclusionary toward others. Well, what's dangerous about Christian nationalism? Not just nationalism, but Christian nationalism. I can read it up here. The print's getting small. Even in its more banal forms, it can be quietly insidious and quietly violent toward those who are not counted as genuinely American and or truly Christian. In its more extreme forms, it can be egregiously insidious and explicitly violent toward those not counted as genuinely American and or truly Christian. Think of genocide, unjust legal systems, racial profiling, unjust policing, discrimination in schools, workforce, and so forth. It confuses deep personal identities in that national belonging and values equate to religious belonging and values. And this is what Kierkegaard was so concerned about. I'm Christian because I'm Danish. I'm Danish because I'm Christian. It's the same thing. That's a confusion of identities. It is dangerous to the Christian nationalist because it creates internal hostilities, angst, resentment, etc., and detracts from genuine Christian belief and practice. It's not just dangerous to those who are on the other side of Christian nationalism, it's also dangerous to the Christian nationalist. It is alienating and dehumanizing both for Christian nationalists and for their neighbors. I'm probably missing some things, so you can add them in the Q&A here very shortly. Well, how can Christian nationalism be stopped or slowed, perhaps more realistically? We can remind Christian nationalists that nationalism is contingent and relatively recent. Genesis, God created nations. That's not there. Well, you do have the whole Abraham thing, but that's not the same thing. Remind Christian nationalists that identity is more permeable and deeper than national identity, which is a human and temporal construct. So kind of the same thing on the other side, right? Said a different way. We can remind Christian nationalists that border thinking is exclusionary and ultimately self-defeating. We can remind Christian nationalists that human and cultural religious diversity is a positive value and not a threat. So purity culture assumes that those who are other and different are a threat. And the result is that those who adhere to it lose out because of that. So continuing, we can remind Christian nationalists about true Christianity. That's, you know what I mean by that. Authentic or genuine, or what really is, what does it mean to be Christian? How, insofar as we can understand that. The gospel accounts of Jesus' care for the least of these, the little ones, the marginalized, the left out. And inclusion of all, the peaceable and inclusive nature of the gospel. Even Paul understood that the gospel is not exclusionary. Jew and Gentile brought together, the dividing barrier wall of hostility is broken, destroyed. We can remind Christian nationalists that genuine Christianity transcends nations, cultures, and borders. And we can remind Christian nationalists that Jesus was neither an American nor a Christian. You might want to save that one till the end, like I did. But a Palestinian Jew, an immigrant, and a hybrid Galilean, Judean, Palestinian, unappreciated in his own hometown. What is he doing here? Isn't that the son of the carpenter? Right? That's all I got. So let's open it for questions. Oh, let me say, actually, it's not quite all I got. This book just came out recently, like a week ago, so I haven't had a chance to read through it all. But I did read through the beginning that I could get hold of. Amanda Tyler's How to End Christian Nationalism, but I think this will be an important contribution to this discussion.
If you have a question, please wait for the mic so that we can get your question recorded for the people who will be watching the recording later.
Yes, it is. Could you just describe what took place in your grandmother's church? I imagine it was more than waving flags, because some of us need to know what this is looking like in churches.
Yeah, the part that I didn't block out? Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating in that the service was structured through a pre-programmed and produced third-party, and this was not produced by the church, this was produced by some other organization. And it was very political. It was very explicit. It was very anti-Obama, actually. I mean, I think the church probably should have gotten in trouble, right, for showing. But it was this production, and so people were sitting through images of patriotic images, poems, and songs. So it was a whole production. But it was not done by the church. It was shown by the church, and then there were kind of moments of response. Or we had two little kids with us, so we were just kind of happily distracted from what else was going on. But But yeah, I mean, imagine not just that church, but many other churches using the same programmed production and in their liturgy, their worship service. Churches get in trouble all the time, right, for doing things like taking the American flag out of the sanctuary. I know of a church in St. Paul that went through a lot of tumult and turmoil, lost a lot of members when they decided to remove the flag from the sanctuary. But that kind of thing, again, there's a spectrum, but it's part of people's cultural memory, people's identity. That's the power of that kind of mythological and cultural formation that ties these things together in a way that can be pernicious.
Hey, Kyle.
Hi, Dwayne.
As you were, especially on, how to end it parts of your presentation, and I just want to raise this because I'm not as hopeful, but I'll tell you why. Because your how to end it was it was a Christian or religious project. It's religious language or religious conversation. Reading Tim Alberta's work and Russell Moore's work, how much, and this is what I'm frightened about, that it is not a religious project, that Christianity is the vehicle that is being corralled for a nationalist project.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, I'm at a loss at how to address that, because I don't think the Christianity is the critical piece anymore. And I may be wrong, but that's just sort of my read on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we need good politicians, Dwayne. First of all, that is, and this has always been true, that religion and Christianity in particular has been used as a vehicle of the state. Missions, the missionaries may have thought they were doing good things. They were co-opted by the powers of the state for economic, capitalist expansion reasons. And so that's where, at least if we are going to slow it down, people need to be awoken. Is that the right word? They need to, that's a bad word these days, not here, but people need to wake up to that reality, to the fact that they are being co-opted, that even their good intentions, perhaps, even what to them feels right and natural. Well, this is my culture, this is my language, this is my people. That might feel good and natural, a la Grundtvig, but it is easily co-opted by powers that are greater than them and manipulated. So if we can at least wake people up to that reality, and to have them think critically about what it really means to follow Jesus, who Jesus really was, what Christianity, and of course Jesus wasn't even a Christian. Is that on film? I mean, right? I mean, he was a Jew who was leading a group of people in a new way of understanding the Torah and interpreting it and applying it in the world, and then of course Christianity follows. But if we are to be following Jesus as the leader of our, the exemplar, the ideal of our faith, then we have to attend to what he actually cared about and how he actually demonstrated commitment and love. But I hear you, Dwayne. It's hard. It's not easy.
Well, I have to agree with Dwayne. I'm also very concerned and somewhat pessimistic right now about this whole thing. I'm really thankful that we're more aware of this, but my pessimism comes from the fact that we won't do very much about it because we don't know what to do. And maybe this book will be a cookbook on what to do.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be bold. I think we have to engage people we know in a civil conversation and not just suggest to them that they might be wrong, but to really point out some consequences of their actions. And I wish I knew a better answer to this, but right now, several months ago I saw Rob Reiner's film. And if you haven't, and I can't remember the name of it, but he helped produce it, and it's a really arresting film about the fact that January 6th is documented to have been the result of Christian nationalist activism. The mobilization of that huge crowd on January 6th came about because of Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
And that's really scary to me in our democracy. So it's really more of I would just say thank you for helping us be more aware. Please help us be more active.
Yeah. And I do think from what I was able to read of Amanda Tyler's book, she will help people think about not just the sort of individual conversations and questions, that the thinking part, but also the organizing part, which is really important. And she points out Christian nationalists have been organized. Yeah, for a long time. Yeah. I don't know where the mic has ended up, but there are a lot of hands over here. Okay. Yeah.
When did under God come into the Pledge of Allegiance?
One nation under God. What did under God commend in the Pledge of Allegiance? Oh, when was it put into the pledge? Do you know? Oh. 1950s. Yeah, I don't know exactly, but we can Google it. We'll find out.
Would you please talk about Christian nationalism in Germany in the 1920s and 30s and its role in World War II?
Yeah. Well, do we have another hour? Not that I could fill an hour on that, but it is in the AP history book. Germany obviously was one of those countries where nationalism takes root. And of course, the Nazi ideology connects to many of these things that we're talking about in terms of cultural myths, identity, a sense of people need to have some sense of empowerment as a cultural people, and the purity culture that goes into that, the kind of even to the extent of the church being co-opted in that and making Jesus into an Aryan Jesus, not a Palestinian Jew immigrant, right? But actually an Aryan Jesus, which is a complete misread and misinterpretation of history and its lies. Yeah. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, is a very important figure in the sort of theological analysis of German nationalism and critique of German nationalism, and is one who even gave his life in opposition to it and to Hitler, despite his own theological wrestlings with his pacifism and so forth. So very important, and it's important to keep that in mind as we deal with our own cultural and social impulse toward nationalism. Yeah.
You answered what I had for a question, but I already had the microphone. I just wanted to share that I grew up in Wisconsin, and I can remember the flags in our sanctuary. I was a Methodist. It was before the merger. We had the United States flag, we had the state of Wisconsin flag, we had the Methodist flag. And I imagine we might have been able to talk our way out of having those flags. I don't think there was any way we would have gotten rid of the Green Bay Packer Vincent. That wasn't going to happen.
Yes. Deep cultural formation and identity. Yeah.
When you told your story about the flag waving church service, I examined my prejudice or my picture of white nationalism, and all that comes up is Protestantism. All the way back to televangelists and megachurches, and way back to the Ku Klux Klan, who were against Catholicism. And I wonder, where is the Catholic Church as an institution and Catholic worshipers as a group of people in this picture?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and not one that I'm qualified necessarily to answer right now. I do think it's interesting that because Catholicism is a global church, and not divisible in the same way as Protestant denominations and Protestant churches are, I wonder if, at least in principle, it might be less inclined to be given over to, again, at least in principle, less inclined to be given over to nationalism because of its global construct.
I'm curious whether Amanda Tyler intends a message in the cover of her book, How to End Christian Nationalism, in that she crosses out nationalism but not the Christian word, and whether that's assuming that we all liberals agree that nationalism is a problem, but that Christian is the opposite, a problem.
So the question is whether Amanda Tyler might intend a message in kind of crossing out nationalism, but not Christian, and assuming that nationalism is the problem for everyone and not Christian, per se.
At least for liberals.
For liberals, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Might be interesting. Maybe in the book she indicates what's going on there, or what her ultimate desires might be. I know she has a question here too. Okay, you saw.
I just have a question.
Yeah, I know.
Whenever I encounter somebody who is a Christian nationalist, I find that my most powerful argument is looking at history and how there has never been a consensus of what is Christian, including today. And I'll just point out how I'm a Christian, but I don't think like that. Therefore, that's what led the founding people of our country to establish a boundary between a religion and state, because we have to learn to get along without having religious ideals guide our principles as a nation. I always find that's my most powerful argument. And they're quiet, and they don't have much to say.
Yeah, I think that's always, to me at least, an important place to start when it is pointing to the diversity historically of perspectives and positions. Again, open people's imaginations a little bit, and hopefully bring in some humility about one's own position. Can we have one more? Because I know she's been patient.
We've run out of time here, so if you have more questions, please feel free to talk to Kyle. Okay. There is that opportunity. Could we please have a round of applause for an excellent presentation?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
I really appreciate a kind of balanced and historical view of Christian nationalism, and rather than a diatribe. So, thank you.